Hello everyone and welcome to episode 8 of the SAP TechByte series on RESTful Application Programming Model. In this TechByte, I'll walk you through validations in RAP and how they help ensure data consistency in your business objects. So when building applications, one of the most critical aspects is data integrity, and that's exactly where validations come into picture. Let us take an example where a user is trying to create a sales order and after saving, he notices that by mistake, he had entered the amount as a negative value and let's say the delivery date is in the past. So now fixing this data is going to be a tedious job, but we could have easily avoided it using validations, which ensures that only the right data gets saved to the system. A validation in RAP is an optional part of the business object behavior that checks whether your data is consistent and adheres to the business rules. In other words, you can consider validations as a checkpoint before saving data. Validations ensure or evaluate whether the required conditions are met and whether the values are logically correct and also whether the data can be saved to the database or not. Validations are not manually called, but they are automatically triggered by the RAP framework, and they run only when specific trigger conditions are fulfilled. The conditions could be create, update, or delete for the fields specified for validation. Validations are executed at a predefined point in the business object lifecycle called the trigger time. In RAP, this is during the save sequence or on save. So the process flow of validation is simple. It starts as soon as the user modifies the data and triggers save. The validation gets executed and the logic for validation decides whether the data should get saved to the database or not. If the validation logic detects inconsistent data, it will be rejected and the details of the failed instances will be stored in the fail structure. Additionally, a validation can return messages to the consumer by passing them to the corresponding table in the reported structure. And these messages can appear as errors that will block save or warnings as an information to the user. In short, validations in RAP act as a powerful safeguard mechanism to ensure that your business object data remains accurate, consistent, and reliable. So now that we are clear about the concept of validations, let's go to the system and see a quick demo. In this demo, I have a simple travel application with few fields like customer ID, start date, end date, status, total price field, etc. And for this demo, I will implement validations on start date and end date fields. So we'll consider three conditions here. One is whether the start date and end date fields are filled before saving. Second is whether the start date is equal or greater than today's date. And third is whether the end date is set as a date after start date. So let's get into the system and implement the validations. Okay, so this is my travel application and you can see that I already have few records here. I'm going to implement validations on the start date and end date fields. So let's go back to ADT and see how it is implemented. So this is the behavior definition of my travel application, and in order to make sure that begin date and end date are not left empty before saving, I'm going to declare them as mandatory fields. So let's do that first. So field mandatory and then mention the fields begin date and end date. Okay, so with this we have declared that the fields are mandatory, and now the next step is to declare the validation methods. So for that add the keyword validation and the method name can be validate dates, and the triggering event will be on save for create, and then the fields begin date and end date. Okay, so with this we have declared the validation. Now you can see that there is a small message that appears here on the screen, and it has two messages. First is validate dates method is not implemented. which we can come to it later. And there is one more message which says validate dates is not assigned to any determine action or not even prepare. So this is because in order to include the validation for the draft instances, we have to mention it inside the prepare action. So let's do that first. So let's say validation, validate dates is the method, and we have declared it inside the prepare action. So now you can see that there's only one message which says the validate dates method is not implemented yet. So this is fine. At this point, you can activate the behavior definition so that it contains all the changes that we did so far, and then the next step we can implement the validate dates method. So click on the quick assist and accept the proposal to add method for validation, validate dates. And this method declaration and implementation, or the method definition and implementation, will appear in the local handler class of the behavior implementation. So this is the behavior implementation class, and you can see that the validate dates method is defined, and you also can see the implementation of the validate dates method. Now the last step is to implement the logic for the validation. So for that, let us quickly add a read statement. Okay, so this is the read statement. Here we are reading the travel instance and capturing the values for the fields begin date, end date and travel ID in the internal table for travels. So after this step, we are going to consider the 4 conditions or the 3 conditions that I mentioned in the beginning. So first is to check whether the begin date is left blank or not. So let's add the code for that. So for that, first we'll just loop through the travel internal table, and we'll start capturing the messages in the reported travel table. So now let's check the condition whether the begin date field is left empty. So inside the loop, let's add the code to check the begin date. So here is the code. So if the begin date field is left empty, we are adding or providing the message to the user to enter the begin date. Okay, no, so now the next condition is we have to check whether the begin date is equal to or greater than the system date or today's date. So let's add the code for that. Okay, so let's add the condition if the begin date is less than the system date or today's date, and if the field is not empty, then we are showing the message begin date should be on or after the system date. So this message is also updated to the reported travel table. Now we are coming to the third condition to check whether the end date is entered or not. So let's add the code similar to what we had added for begin date. Okay, so the third condition is we are checking if travel end date is initial, then we are showing the message to the user to enter the end date value in the field. Okay, so once that is also done, we are coming to the last condition that we have to check, which is the end date field. If it is filled, we have to make sure that the end date field is a value that is after the begin date. So let's add the code for that. Okay, so the fourth condition also the code we have added. Here we are checking if the end date and begin date both are filled. We are checking if the end date is lesser than begin date. If it is a lesser date or date which is before the begin date, then we are showing the message that the begin date should always be before the end date. So with this, we have completed the coding for checking all the 4 conditions that should be checked during the validation logic is getting executed. Let's check the code that we have added. Okay, so then let's activate the method. Okay, it's activated. Now let's go to the behavior definition. Let's check the behavior definition also, and you can see that the message for adding the implementation, it is gone now. So let's activate the behavior definition also. Okay, it is activated now, and now we are ready to check the travel application. Okay, so I have reloaded the travel application, and let me create a new record. So let's give some value for the travel ID, agency ID, customer, and also some values for the booking fee and the total price. You also have the status. So except begin date and end date, I've entered the value for all other fields. And now let me click on create. So it doesn't let me save. It gives me a message to enter the begin date and end date. So let me do one thing. I'll enter the starting date or the begin date as a value which is before today. Let's say I give this value, and again I'll try to create. This again gives me a new message now. This is coming from our second condition, which says begin date must be on or after the system date. So the second condition is triggered now. I'll fix this issue, and let's say I give a different date, and again I'll click on create. So now you can see that the error for the begin date is gone now. And now I have the third condition getting triggered, which says we have to enter a value for the end date. So I'll add a value for the end date, but I'll do one negative testing here by mentioning that or by providing the value as value which is after, before the begin date. So let me click on create again. So here the fourth condition is getting triggered. It says begin date must not be after end date. So here the end date that I had provided is before the begin date. So this again the fourth condition gets triggered and it doesn't let me save. Now I have to fix the end date value. I'll provide a different date now, and let me try creating again. Okay, so now the record gets saved. So this is because all the four conditions we had specified in the validation method or the logic inside the validation method gets checked one by one, and it shows the message on the UI so that the user gets to know that there is an issue in the data that they have entered, and they can correct them. Okay, so this was a quick demo to show how validations can help you save only consistent data to the database, and with very few steps how we can implement validations in your application. So you can also try how validations can be easily implemented in your application. In case you have any questions, you can let us know in the comments. We'll be back very soon with another episode of SAP TechByte. Till then, take care.